Developer Eidos Montreal's take on Guardians of the Galaxy brings us one of the very best story-driven games of 2021. Simply titled Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, it presents as a single-player action game. No multiplayer, no online, no co-op here. It's you, starring as Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, haphazardly adventuring through a well-scripted story, chapter by chapter. Based on the Dawn engine, as used in Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Eidos Montreal again shows a real mastery in realising the art of the Guardians universe. Everything from their ship, the Milano, to each newly discovered planet is meticulously dotted with detail. Playing the game on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X then is a genuine treat. Both consoles sport two modes, a 1080p 60fps performance mode and a 4K 30fps quality mode, each with distinct pros and cons. So which is the best way to play PC excluded? And can Xbox Series S also push a satisfying experience on its one 30fps mode? Let's find out. Guardians of the Galaxy is a visual tour de force. Let's get that out of the way. It often looks stunning, and that starts with the locations. The Quarantine Zone, a planet of derelict machinery fused with a pink crystalline gel, is a perfect backdrop for the Guardians' first mission. Materials come out beautifully in the midday sun. Light shafts seep from behind pillars of dense scrapyard tech, giving the world a rich, opulent look. Lighting also brings out the sharp specular layer on the pink rubble, a lot of which is destructible. All round there's a heavy art-driven approach to each area, each set piece, as we descend further and further in. For fans of the comics and the movies, it's a joy to take in the details of the Guardians ship too. The cockpit and the lounge areas are presented in full splendour here. Equally to see Peter Quill's childhood home, viewed through the eyes of a teenager in the 80s. Later planets have wildly different biomes, of course. The second mission, for example, puts us under rainy, scorched skies. Wind physics affects foliage, and it's a battle against the elements as we hop between each moss-covered island. Where again, material work is standout. In short, the game looks very good. Extremely good in fact, and while there are shortcomings in polish, in the visual bugs at launch, and even frame rate, which I'll get onto, at its core Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy translates well to a video game format. But let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, while the visual style is in line with the two James Gunn directed movies, the character designs are different. Much like the Avengers game of last year, there's a step away from their cinematic depiction. A recasting, if you like, or a reinterpretation. In Guardians of the Galaxy's case, I must say, it really didn't affect my enjoyment of the game at all. The chemistry between the new cast, exquisitely modelled and motion captured as they are, completely outshines the change. The dialogue between the Guardians is witty, there are laughs, and the story has some heart. In the end, the plot alone has enough gravitational pull to make the game worth playing. It says a lot that, in my experience anyway, the new faces became just a side note.
Last and definitely least, Peter Jason Quill.
That's it? That's all you wrote?
It was a character limitation.
Okay, so that's the lowdown, and really there's a lot to love here. The combat is strong, if not too exceptional at the start. You take sole charge of Star-Lord in a third-person shooter style, firing and gliding as you dole out commands to the other Guardians. There are upgrade paths, dialogue trees, there's platforming, puzzle solving, quick-time events, and even a Star Fox-style on-rails minigame. The game hits the mark more than it misses, and the pace of action quickens the more you unlock. There's a sense though that it gets overwhelmed with its own ambition. For example, you can't overlook some bugs that have crept in at launch. These include massive streaming stutters, notably while flying into the first planet. There are lighting quirks during camera transitions as the buffer fades in and out across characters. And a lesser gripe, animations snap awkwardly while crawling or climbing over objects too. Now, all combined, these quirks distract a little from the rest of the package. We might see a fix for some of the visual bugs. Patches were, after all, rolling out even during the process of reviewing the game. That aside though, let's return to the question at hand, which is, what is the best way to play on console right now? The basics are, PS5 and Xbox Series X are practically identical in visual settings, in foliage quality, effects, shadows, they're closely matched in feature set. Each has an identical set of modes too. The quality mode, as we've mentioned, runs at 3840x2160 on PS5 and Series X, capped as it is at 30 frames per second. Temporal anti-aliasing is used on each, and it's all round the premier way to enjoy the game's visuals. There's a chance of dynamic resolution scaling here too, however, every pixel count in my testing returns a native 4K on this mode. Next there is the performance mode. This targets a native 1920x1080 to sustain a smoother 60fps on PS5 and Series X, so put another way, that's a quarter of the overall pixel count of 4K in order to double your frame rate. So there's the trade. Needless to say, the divide in image quality between the two modes is pretty stark. Yes, you can play at 60fps, and for playability's sake, it's a great way to enjoy the game's combat, but the cost to image quality is pretty evident. Here's Series X as an example, though this applies to PS5 as well. Comparing the two modes, the first thing you'll notice is of course how performance mode affects the rendering of fine hair and fur elements. Sadly, at 1080p, dithering artifacts creep in across sub-pixel elements. The TAA method can't address such fine detail, and so there's breakup, visual noise, when scaling 1080p up to a 4K display. This is of course solved in the 4K 30fps quality mode on right, where everything becomes pin sharp. It's a problem fixed by brute force of using, well, more pixels. Looking at other shots, quality mode also boosts other settings. You get high quality textures, anisotropic filtering, and, while subtle, a better form of ambient occlusion. Mostly this ambient occlusion upgrade affects the accuracy of indirect shading in small crevices and the shading across grass too. Geometry LODs also are much improved, particularly in the shot of the quarantine zone, where the ruins appear fully formed at range on quality mode next to a lower polygon form on performance mode. It simply means, in other words, pop-in is less obvious as you run forward, being that there's a high quality asset already being rendered. Elsewhere, well, we see shadow draw and foliage density are boosted in quality mode. See in this shot of the front garden how performance mode suffers slightly more pop-in as the camera pushes forward. Quality mode then is much more than a resolution bump, but we can't have it all at once on console. If 4K and 30fps is the way the game was meant to be seen, to be enjoyed in the cinematic sense, then 1080p at 60fps is arguably how it's best played. Before we go to the frame rate testing though, a final note on Xbox Series S. The bad news here is Eidos Montreal cuts into this version more deeply than you'd expect to get it running smoothly. The high frame rate 60fps option is missing on Series S, and so you have only one way to play at 1080p and 30fps. Looking at side-by-side comparisons to Series X, there are changes beyond this too, sadly. You have worse grass density, a setting below even the 60fps performance mode's grass on PS5 and Series X, which strips the front garden bare in this opening shot. Also notable is that geometry pop-in is far more obvious across the jelly-like structures of the quarantine zone, with low-quality geometry meshes as we fly through. From the outset, the premium PS5 and Series X versions are the definite preference if you're playing on console. The key of course being the option for 60fps on each, as set by default once you boot the game. To start with PS5 in its performance mode then, PS5 hits 60fps a majority of the time while exploring, but it's certainly not 100% locked. Combat flags some issues as ever. In some cases, one frame dips tick along as you issue commands to other Guardians. In other, more Alpha Effects heavy moments, it runs with glaring drops into the low 50fps region and occasionally 40s. This happens when moving between areas for a spell too, though typically the heaviest of drops are restricted to combat. PS5's performance mode gets over the line at 60fps overall, but it's for sure in need of tightening up. Still, it's the recommended way to enjoy the game's combat at least. You get the full 60Hz feedback for air dodging around enemies, active reloads, and hitting QuickTime event prompts for a finishing strike. It just flows much better in action, but again, while it's mostly fine for exploration, it can at times tank when faced with too many enemies. A bit of a shame, but seemingly we can't have it all at once. And so, on that note, let's switch over to the 30fps quality mode on PS5 here, where in general this is much more stable in hitting its target. Even at an ambitious 4K, drops under 30fps are limited to these single frame hitches. You might notice them mostly in cutscene changes or while issuing orders. They're a mild nuisance, I'm not gonna lie, but rare enough overall compared to the more regular drops in the 60fps mode. Pushing on to Series X in its performance mode next, we have marginally better results. This is essentially the same as PS5 in that it holds to 60fps most of the time, but with likewise drops into the 40s during combat in the worst case. That said, I did notice these drops are less frequent overall, especially when navigating the first planet. Spots where performance tanks on PS5 while moving between areas, for example, run at 60fps on Series X. It might simply be that it's a patch ahead of the PS5 edition, or it's purely incidental. The bottom line for Series X though is it's broadly in the same 50 to 60fps range for combat, but with one key advantage: the availability of VRR support. Variable refresh rate support helps the perception of sub-60 drops like this on compatible VRR displays, which sadly PS5 can't do as it currently stands. Regardless, the performance mode is a solid way to experience the game in action, but do expect drops on Series X at times. One last point on Series X pertains to the 30fps quality mode. This is essentially the same as PS5's in its delivery. We have a 30fps lock a majority of the way, but again, it's at times blighted by one-frame hitches in cutscenes and battles. Overall, it's robust enough to play this way, and with 4K rendering plus high-grade settings, it's a pretty good pick for image purists. On the other end of the spectrum is of course Xbox Series S, which only has this 30fps mode at its disposal. Running at 1080p with cutbacks in foliage settings too, you'd certainly hope the sacrifices lead to a decent 30fps lock, and to an extent it does, though it's not perfect. Series S is ultimately similar to the other two machines in their 30fps readings. You'll see one-frame dips again from time to time. It's very playable, though lacking a watertight lock on that number. The cutbacks run deeper for this version, no question about it, and as you might expect for a 4 teraflop machine, but it's enough to enjoy the game. So where does that leave us? Among the best superhero games of recent years, Guardians of the Galaxy will feature in Game of the Year lists by 2021's end, though with some caveats. Visually, it's captivating, the character dialogue is well written, and there's plenty of depth to explore in its combat. But there's a lingering sense the project needed more time to address its bugs. Likewise, the performance hitches present even on PS5 and Series X are a downside. A few patches down the line, we could maybe see an improvement here, and I hope so too, because at its core Guardians is well worth checking out. To the question at hand, PS5 and Series X are fine ways to play in the console space, the only regret being the hard switch between 4K and 1080p in order to access 60fps gameplay. It's one extreme to the other in its preference for image quality or smooth playability. Accepting all of this though, Eidos Montreal's take on Guardians of the Galaxy is a surprise triumph that I hope gets the attention that it deserves after launch. But that's all from me. If you did find this useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.